Hello and welcome to OETC and Microsoft's M365 onboarding webinar series. My name is Stephen Yamada with OETC's communications team. Today's session will cover Azure Active Directory and will be presented by Ryan Burns, Account Technology Strategist on the USA Education team at Microsoft. This session is being recorded and will be sent out early next week. I'll also take a quick moment to highlight OETC's renewals team, some of whom are on today's webinar. If you have any licensing questions, you can reach out to help@oetc.org, and someone from the team will be happy to assist you. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. Like Stephen said, my name is Ryan Burns. I am an account technology strategist on the United States education team. I'm based out of Houston, Texas, and I cover a lot of higher education institutions in Texas and Louisiana. So today we're going to be talking all about the wonderful world of Azure AD. We're going to be starting at a pretty high level and then diving into a lot of different areas that are normally top of mind for a lot of K-12 institutions, really across the United States. Before we jump directly into the portal, I do want to go through a few different websites. I'm not a huge PowerPoint fan, so I'm going to really stick to showing you some websites, and then we'll make sure to get you the links to these websites after the call as well, so you see everything that I'm showing you as well. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. The first area that I'd like to cover, and you should be able to see my screen right now. The first area I'd like to cover is just going to be the overview of pricing within Azure AD. So what are those different licensing levels? Because it's going to be really important once we get into the portal. So right off the bat, everyone has access to Azure AD free. And that covers these topics you see right here. So everything from Azure AD Connect to cloud authentication, device registration, a lot of user provisioning, single sign-ons, multi-factor authentication at a very basic level, and that's the same across the board. But as we start going down this list, you'll start noticing that some of those services are no longer available in that first tier and really start being seen in Office 365 apps, Premium P1 or Premium P2. So Office 365 apps, that's available to anyone that has A1, A3, A5 licensing. Premium P1 is either standalone or it's available if you have A3 licensing. And then Premium P2 is going to be available again as another standalone, or it's in the A5 package. So as we start scrolling down this list, you'll notice that you start getting more customization options through company branding, self-service password reset for cloud users, device write back, so you can start updating device records within Azure AD and have it write back to your on-premise AD. And then we get into the premium features that are really found in that P1 or P2 environment. And these are things like custom banned passwords lists, self-service password reset, Microsoft Cloud App Discovery, advanced usage and security reports, even things into dynamic groups, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, application proxy, conditional access. And then once we get into that identity protection and identity governance, that's where it's really going to be in that premium P2 arena. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the call, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it again because it's at that higher premium level. But I wanted to bring this up just so as we start running through, you have an idea of the demo environment that I will be running is going to have all of the features. So if you don't have all of the features, your views may look a little different, and this is a great website to come to reference, okay, what am I going to see versus what you saw in this presentation? The other area that I like to just kind of go over at the start is going to be Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect is going to play a pretty pivotal role in a lot of the conversations we're going to have around what does the synchronization aspect look like? What is being pulled in from your on-premise environment with users and groups and other objects? And then how do we start using Azure AD to authenticate to some of your cloud-based applications? Or even how do you start setting up some of your on-premise applications to use Azure Active Directory as the authentication source? So on this page, again, I'll make sure you have a link to this page, but I think this is a very nice way of summarizing exactly what we're going to talk about. So normally you have your users and devices that authenticate to your on-premise Active Directory just like normal. And then you can have your on-premise applications that are using Active Directory as that authentication source. When you start putting in Azure Active Directory, you need a way to connect your on-premise Active Directory to Azure so you have a seamless sign-on experience and a single account for your users. You don't want them to have a completely separate account for your Office 365 environment that they do when they're logging into their computers, right? Fewer accounts, fewer passwords is always a better user experience. And that's where Azure AD Connect comes in. So that is an application that runs in between your on-premise Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory environment. And it has several different parts. And the main feature is the synchronization aspect. So what it does is it lives in the middle and it synchronizes your users and groups and other objects and makes sure that the records on-premise match the records that exist in Azure AD. So if you have a user with a certain ID on your on-premise environment, that ID matches in your Azure environment as well. This is a way to make sure, again, that passwords are going to be staying the same across the board. Users are staying the same. So when you're starting to create some of the groups we're going to talk about later, it's not separate logins. And when we start talking about logins and authentication, there's really three main authentication methods that Azure AD Connect allows you to take advantage of. The first one, and the most popular, is the Azure AD password hash synchronization. So that is fully cloud-based, and that lives in this environment here. And it allows for your users to log in against Azure AD directly instead of using your on-premise environment. And what it does is it synchronizes the user's password hashes to Azure AD. So that means that those on-prem password hashes are going to be synced to Azure AD and stored. The other option is something that's Azure AD pass-through authentication. This is very similar, but the difference is instead of storing those password hashes, your users are going to, when they log into something, they're going to actually authenticate back to your on-premise AD environment through the use of some on-premise servers that allow for your users to hit the on-premise AD environment instead of hitting Azure AD for authentication. So they come in, they say, hey, this is my username, this is my password. It queries the on-premise AD, make sure it's correct, and then it kicks them over to wherever they're trying to get to. Again, this means no password hashes are going to be stored within Azure AD. The last one is going to be Azure AD Federation Service, or ADFS. This still allows users to sign on to cloud-based services like Office 365, but it is going to use your on-premise Active Directory services solely. This is really great if you want to control all aspects of the authentication. So no authentication happens in the cloud. Everything is hitting your on-premise AD. And this is great when you have some of those advanced authentication requirements, like smart card authentication, or you're using a third-party multi-factor authentication, or you have just special security requirements that require that. So the big thing that Azure AD Connect plus these Azure AD authentication principles allows you to do is not only have your account synced in this Azure AD space, it allows you to start adding in SaaS-based applications like Google Apps for Education, ServiceNow as a ticketing system, maybe even Workday if you're using that for staff and faculty employee records. It allows you to have, again, a single account that is spread out across all of these different SaaS-based services, which is really awesome. This could also be something that some of you already have set up, and I applaud you for that. Other ones, if you don't have it set up yet, it's definitely a great step to making a cloud hybrid environment. The other page that I wanted to quickly touch on is going to be this decision tree. So that's a lot of options, right? You have password hash, pass-through, ADFS. How do you know when to use a certain one? This decision tree isn't the end-all be-all, but it does help start inform those decisions. So you can quickly run through this and see, okay, do you want to handle Azure AD to handle sign-in completely in the cloud? Yes or no, and then you start traversing down, and you'll get to a point where you have these different options, and these different options are referenced on this page as well. So this is a great resource that I'll make sure you get if you're an institution that is deciding to move towards this direction. So with those kind of two basic, the licensing and Azure AD and how that interacts with the Azure AD overall, let's jump into Azure Active Directory. So logging into it. So if you've never logged into Azure Active Directory before, there's really three main ways. The first one is going to be through the Office or the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. I'm sure you're familiar with this portal, and it's fantastic for managing all aspects of your Office 365 environment. If you come in here and you go to show all, you'll notice that under admin centers, you have several different choices to pick from, everything from the security and compliance dashboard to Exchange, SharePoint, and Azure Active Directory. If you click on this, it'll take you directly to the Azure AD portal. Or you can also log in directly to the Azure AD portal by going to aad.portal.azure.com right at the top. This uses the same authentication that you use to log into your M365 admin portal. It just takes you directly to this location. The third option is something that's used less frequently, but it is there. You can log in directly through the Azure portal. So if you have web or cloud-based resources within Azure, you can actually access Azure AD from that location as well. So those are the main three areas. All of them are going to take you back to the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. When you land on this page, the first thing you're going to see is your dashboard. This is configurable and customizable for you. And to do so, all you have to do is go to edit, and you can start adding in some of the tiles you see over here. These tiles can be things from what is your status of your Azure AD Connect to your users and groups, a direct link to it, what's new, Azure portal links, a whole bunch of really great features. Say that you are leading a team that's going to be running the Azure AD implementation, and you want to make sure all of your users have the same experience. You have that ability by downloading, and it'll download a JSON of this dashboard template, and then you can send it to your teammates and they can upload it under new dashboard and upload. Great way to make sure everyone's seeing the same things and making almost like an Azure AD security center or an Azure AD dashboard for everyone to see the things that they need to see. Moving over to the left-hand side, you'll notice that we have two items above favorites and then your favorites listed below. So we talked about the dashboard. The next one is all services. So all services, if you click into this, this is going to be all of the different areas within Azure AD that you'll have access to. You will see more or less depending on your licensing level, like we talked about before. But the gist of it here is these are the areas, and you can click in and go to any one of these directly, or you can star them and it'll add them to the favorites on the left-hand side. So administrative units, clicked it, and then it goes away. Great way to, if you start using Azure AD and you start noticing that you're really going to, the Azure AD risky users location a lot, hit the favorites, and then it's just on the left-hand side. Now, the main area, though, that you'll be interacting with the most is going to be the Azure AD Directory. When you click on this, you'll notice that all of a sudden we have a whole bunch of more blades on the left-hand side. We have tons of stuff across the top. You'll see sign-ins here, tenant information, all sorts of wonderful things. The blade on the left-hand side is going to be divided into three main areas. You're going to have your manage section where you'll spend most of your time. You're going to have your monitoring section, which is really where the sign-ins, audit logs, general logs, diagnostic settings, really where you can start looking at your environment and then understanding what's happening. Or maybe a user says, hey, I think something happened with my account, or you notice that an account looks compromised or was logging into something very strangely. You can start diving into the sign-in logs. I'll show you how you can also get to the sign-in logs from other locations that might be a little bit more helpful, but just know that it does exist here. The troubleshooting and support is you have access to a support line. You can come to this location and you can either go to Virtual Assistant, which will take you through a chat experience, or you can go to New Support Request and submit a support ticket like you would for other services. But the area that I really want to spend our time in is right here. We're going to try to get through as many of these as we can, but it is a long list and there's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to hit on the really main topics. So the first one is going to be the users section. So these users will be either your cloud-based users that you create accounts in Azure AD, or if you have Azure Active Directory Sync going, you will actually see your on-premise accounts here as well. So taking a kind of high-level look at this, you'll notice we have a new blade that shows you new options, all from all users, deleted users, password reset settings, user settings, and then sign-in logs, audit logs. Again, you're seeing those same monitoring items here as well. Across the top, this is where you'll have new users, guest users, some bulk operations to either bulk create, bulk delete, bulk invite, and we'll go through the invitation process and the creating a user process here shortly. It also has a link to the multi-factor authentication. If we click on this, it'll actually take us over to the, this is the basic level multi-factor authentication that I was mentioning before that all levels have access to. This is a very simple way to make sure that multi-factor authentication is turned on for all of your users. But if you have Office 365 or P1 or P2, we'll go through conditional access, which is a much more efficient way to ensure that your users are being forced to use multi-factor authentication on applications that you want them to be, or just across the board. And we'll go through that in a little bit. But at the basic level, if you want to make sure all of your users have multi-factor authentication turned on, you can come into this tool, you can select all, or you can bulk update. When you select your user, you'll notice you have the ability to enable them or manage that user settings. So an important tool to know, it is there, it's on the user's portal, and it just pops out to this multi-factor authentication page. So looking at accounts, so again, I'm living in a demo tenant. These are all accounts that are cloud-based, so you're not going to see a lot of directory synced. And I bring that up because we'll take a look at Adele's account first. You'll notice that you have her name, her user principal name, user type as member, and then directory synced is no. If you were doing Azure Active Directory, this would actually show as yes, if it was an account that was coming from on-premise. It'll also show the identity issuer and then a lot of other information that you can customize by coming to columns and removing or adding more as you see fit. So if we dive into a specific user though, so let's use Adele as an example. So if we dive into her account, you notice again, we have a new pane on the left-hand side that gives us more options specifically about Adele's account. Across the top, we have the ability to edit her account. So if we click on this, we can start editing a lot of these fields. You can start blocking sign-in. If you don't want this user to be logging in anymore, you can start blocking that here. You do have the ability to do minors and consent, so you can start setting age groups, whether or not it's a minor with consent so they can log into applications, or they don't have consent. So this is an option for you, especially in the K-12 environment. So we're going to go back to view though. And you'll notice across the top, we also have the ability to reset passwords and revoke sessions. So reset password is exactly what it sounds like. Very simply, you can come in here, reset Adele's password to a temporary password, send that temporary password to her, and she would then be able to log in, and it'll automatically prompt her to not only reset that password, but also reconfirm her MFA credentials if you have MFA enforced. You can also revoke sessions. So say Adele, for some reason you believe it's a compromised account, so you've reset her password, you can also revoke all the sessions that she's currently logged into. So next time she tries to log in, cache credentials won't happen, and she will be forced to go through the password reset process. Other areas across the side that we will definitely hit on, assigned roles. So these are going to be the administration roles that we'll talk about in the next section. These are going to be the roles that she's been assigned in Azure AD that give this user special ability to do certain things. In this case, Adele has been assigned guest inviter and global reader. So she has the ability, because of this role being assigned to her, to invite guests to the Azure AD environment and read all attributes within Azure AD. And we'll go through what these different types of roles mean a little later, but it's important to know that you can come into this location and actually see the roles that have been assigned to a specific user. You can add assignments, and you can even remove assignments from this location. The next area that you'll notice we have is administrative units. So the best way that I think of thinking about administrative units is it's very similar to organizational units within your on-premise Active Directory. Normally within your OUs or within your Active Directory structure, you have OUs that specific admins have the ability to administer. So you may have a specific school, if you have a centralized environment, a specific school that a specific set of IT administrators or field technicians have the ability to manage those devices or those resources. Administrative units are similar. You are able to add someone to an administrative unit, and that unit can be assigned special roles or special responsibilities based on what that admin unit needs to do. So whether that's administering a special group of computers, having access to certain applications, you can do that through administrative units. There's also groups. This is where you can see what groups a user has access to. So in this specific example, Adele has access to a physical science group, an algebra group, a dynamic student group, as well as an admin security group. So on this list, we're going to go through groups in another section, but this is also where you can add more groups to someone. So you can quickly come in here, say, let's add a membership, and start adding to all the different groups you have within your Azure AD. So really quickly, if you have a user, they need access to a certain type of group, you can come into their user account, go to groups, find the group you want to add them to, and quickly add them and see the results here. And we'll go through what all these different things like assigned versus dynamic, security versus Microsoft 365, cloud versus on-premise. We'll go through that once we get to the group section. Just know you can manage that from here. Another area is going to be the applications. So we talked, when we were talking about authentication earlier, I mentioned how you have the ability to authenticate to SaaS-based apps. So those web apps like Google Apps, Workday, other applications like that. This is where you would see what applications a user has assignments to. So you can quickly come in here and say, Adele is supposed to have access to these applications. She's not able to log into Google Apps. You check here and you notice that that application is not assigned to her. You have quickly been able to find out why someone can't access something. Or when you're onboarding someone and you want to make sure you've gone through all the correct steps, you can come in here and ensure that they've been added to the correct groups. Licenses, this is going to be very similar to the Office 365 portal, where under users, you can dive into a user and see what licenses are assigned to them. Same thing goes for here. So Adele is a student, so she has a Microsoft 365 A5 for Students license assigned to her. Devices is going to show you the devices that this user has logged into and if they are registered to Azure AD. So this is a great tool if you have, authentication onto devices allowed through Azure AD and you're allowing devices to join via Azure AD. You can see the devices that someone has logged into, has authenticated to, and you can enable or disable their access. So if they're using a computer that they're not supposed to be, or a computer, or they've returned a computer, you can make sure to turn off their access through this device's location here. Azure role assignments really is only applicable if you have users or if you have an Azure environment where you're actually spinning up web resources, compute, maybe WVD. This is a great way to come into someone's specific account and see what type of access to certain resources they have. In my demo tenant, I don't have Azure, the Azure portal set up, so none of mine are going to show anything and you won't see any subscriptions. But if you do have that, know that this exists as another way to see what type of resources a certain user has access to. And then the last area that I think is important to mention is going to be the authentication method. So once someone registers for MFA or registers for self-service password reset, we will talk about those two later. This is how you can come in and see what phone information, email information they have put in and update it if the user says that it's incorrect. This is also where you can require them to re-register an MFA. So you can force the MFA process again if the user is having trouble with registration. Maybe they've gotten a new phone and they never transferred over accounts, new phone number, new email. This is a way to force that. You can also start revoking MFA sessions. So forcing, when you revoke a session, this forces everyone to force the MFA process again. So even if they've remembered for 60 days or even if they're logged in, next time they hit a login prompt, they will be forced to do MFA. So pretty awesome things there. Jumping down to activity, this is again where you can start seeing sign-ins related to a specific user. In this case, you can see all the times that Adele have logged in. She hasn't. And then you can start diving into the audit logs and seeing what changes have happened on this specific account within the last month. So on here, you'll notice that she's been added to some groups. She's had a reset user password happen. She was added to specific roles. And this is where you can start diving in and clicking on things and seeing more information as you may need. So that's the users section. I think that really having this explained really helps understand the rest of the Azure Active Directory portions we're going to talk about. The one thing that I do think we should talk through is creating a new user. Again, if you have Azure AD set up, Azure AD Sync set up already, you may not be creating as many users in Azure Active Directory because you're really relying on on-premise identities. However, you do still have the ability to create cloud-only accounts here. So you can go through the process of creating a user. You can set the username and add any domains that you may add, and then go through the process of filling in all the relevant information. This is also where you can start adding specific groups that they should be a member of or specific roles that you'd like them to have access to. So a good example of this would be if you have cloud-based accounts, you have the ability to create maybe a cloud-based global admin. So you always have an administrator account that can log into this just in case something were to happen to your on-prem AD and you're not able to authenticate into the cloud. So that's why you would come in here and go through this process to set up. You also have the ability to invite external users. You just put in their email address, their other information under identity, customize a message if you'd like, and you can even add them to specific roles or specific groups. You'll notice on the left-hand side, we also have deleted users. This is pretty self-explanatory. This is going to be where you can find users that were deleted and restore those users if you want to. You can also dive in and start clicking through and looking through the history or the audit logs to understand what accounts were deleted, who deleted them, and when they were deleted. The password reset, we're going to jump in towards the end because it kind of goes along with security, but this is the area where you can start setting password reset policies for self-service password reset globally across the tenant. And then under user settings, this is where admins can start allowing users to register applications, and we'll talk about app registration here in a little bit. You can start granting or removing access for normal users to access the Azure AD administration portal, or even start connecting your LinkedIn account to your work or school account. So that's going to cover the area of users. And the next thing that I'd love to talk about is going to be groups. So on groups, an important note before we dive into what this pane is like, groups that are synced from your on-premise Active Directory environment can be managed only by your on-premise Active Directory. So although you can see the accounts in Azure AD, you can't make meaningful changes to them in Azure AD. You're going to rely upon doing those changes in on-premise. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to still see the accounts and see memberships within Azure AD. So going back to the users, for Adele, if she was a member of any of those on-premise groups that were being synced to Azure AD, you would still see those accounts there. The same thing goes for mail-enabled security groups and distribution lists. You will still see them in groups, but you won't be able to edit them here because that is handled by the Exchange Admin Center or the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So taking a look at groups, you'll notice it has a similar format to users. You have your groups, your group settings along the side. You have your new group, download groups, refresh, edit the columns across the top, and then your group listings here. Again, since I don't have Azure AD Sync set up, you're not going to see anything other than cloud as a source. But if, again, you had Azure AD Connect set up, you would see your on-premise groups listed here. So this is where you're going to find groups that are either security groups or Microsoft 365 groups. The difference between the two is a security group is what gives access to resources, applications, licenses, and it can be devices, users, service principals, or even other groups in a nested fashion. Microsoft 365 groups are going to be more collaboration-based, and they give access to SharePoint files. The big one is Teams, shared calendar, shared mailboxes. Group members for M365 groups can only be users, which makes sense. So I think a pretty awesome part of the security group process, though, is if we jump into it, you can start managing this specific group from here. So we've been talking a lot about, okay, what about group memberships, assigned roles, applications? You can set up a group and you can give that specific group access to an application pool or give it access to other groups or administrative units. And just like on your on-premise Active Directory, you have the ability to add people to that group, either statically or dynamically. And you don't have to necessarily worry about adding them to individual permissions or individual user roles because you're adding them to a group that then has the correct access. So if we start running down this list, you'll notice at first we drop right into overview and you can see how many members there are in this security group, what type of group it is, the source, whether it's assigned or dynamic, and then how many users, the owners, how many devices, and how many groups. The next area is going to be properties. So this is where you can update the group name. You can enter a description for the group. You notice you can't actually change the group type though. So the group type for this one is set to security. I can't switch that to Microsoft 365. You also notice I can't switch the membership type from assigned. And that's because right here, this security group specifically, I can assign AD roles to it. So I can assign a global reader role, or I can assign a help desk administrator role to this group. So with that turned on, you can't change it from a assigned group to a dynamic group, because we don't want someone to be added to a group dynamically that shouldn't have been added because it was based on some principle that may not be the best thing to base it on. We'll go through group creation here in a second. You'll also notice along the side, we have the ability to go through the different members that are in the group, add members to the group from here. You can set owners, so add multiple owners, remove owners, add it to administrative units, just like a user, and then start looking at what groups that this group is a member of. Assigned roles, like we talked about, this is where you'll see what specific assigned roles this group has, and this one's been added to the guest inviter role. So that means anyone in this group will have access to guest inviter. The other one that comes in handy is setting up a application group. So once you start adding in some of your web-based authentication, you can start adding or creating a group and adding users to it that are allowed to authenticate to that application. So you might have a Google Apps group that is allowed to authenticate to a certain application. Licenses, again, this is how you would assign licenses in bulk. So you may have a dynamic group for faculty and staff, and that group has the license, the A5, A3 for faculty license assigned to it. So anyone that's automatically added to that group would then receive that license once they become a member. And then you also have Azure roles, just like you did with the user accounts. The activity, a lot of these options here are going to be in that premium P2, so I'm not going to spend much time on it, but just know that you have the ability to do just-in-time or privileged access management, which means you can add someone, or you can have this group and the members of that group have access to a specific role for only a specific amount of time. So maybe there's an event happening and you want to make sure that a group can administer something specific. They can only do that for 12 hours, 2 days, an hour, whatever you set that. From here, I think jumping into actually creating a group, just to illustrate how quickly it is and the different steps that come into play. So right off the bat, you have to select between security or M365. Those are the only two types of groups that you can create in Azure AD. The other groups are either created, like I said, in the Exchange at Admin Center or the M365 Admin Center, or on-prem if it's an on-prem based group. So security, we're going to start with that. You give it a name. So let's just call it the test group. The group description, add whatever you'd like here. And then Azure AD roles. You'll notice if I switch this to yes, I am no longer able to change the assigned, but we're going to leave it as no because I want to demonstrate the dynamic user. So let's set up a dynamic user account. You would set an owner. Great practice is to have at least one owner, if not two, just in case, but always set an owner. The owner doesn't have to be a global admin of your tenant or even an administrator of your tenant. If you're creating an M365 group specifically, you could create, or you could give the teacher ownership, right? You could give a staff member ownership if it's a business administration group. But under dynamic query, this is where you set the settings for what a dynamic group is. And a dynamic group is simply a group whose membership is automatically adjusted based on a property and value that you give it. So in this case, we're going to add an expression. These are the properties that you can select from. And you can, there is a process to actually create your own. But we're going to base this one off of, let's do job title. And for me, job title is either student or teacher in this demo environment. So we're going to say job title contains equals whatever you'd like. We're going to go with contains, and we're going to say teacher. Now that I've created this, you'll notice I also have the ability, after I save it, to come back in here and go validate rules. So what this allows me to do is say, okay, this is the user job title, or this is the dynamic rule. Let me add some users and test to see who this is going to work on. I'm selecting random accounts. I'm not sure which ones of these will actually be teacher roles, but I'm hoping at least a few of them are. You hit select and it'll tell you which ones either will not be members or which ones will be. So in this case, Al Fredrickson, if I click view details, you'll notice their job title equals student, so therefore they are not included in this. However, Arden Asher, job title is teacher, so therefore they would be included in this dynamic group. Really great way of just verifying that the rule you just created works. Now, once you create this dynamic group, it's not going to be instantaneous. Sometimes it can be 10 minutes, sometimes it can take upwards of 48 hours. It just depends on how many users it has to go through, whether this is a brand new group, and if you're updating a dynamic group, what types of changes it has to process. So something to keep in mind. So jumping out of group creation and going back to groups, you'll notice that I do have a dynamic student group, and I created this a few days ago. I logged into it. I was looking at this yesterday and I was kind of nervous because it hadn't updated, but it's updated today. So this one is based off of students and simply with a flag for job title equals students. And if I jump over to members, you'll notice that it has automatically added all of my student members. So dynamic groups are fantastic, especially if you're trying to create a dynamic group and then come in here and assign a license. So this is a student group. I can make sure that all of the students here have the Microsoft student license based on whatever level you have and customize the options here. Great way to make sure across the board you're being licensed. So jumping from a specific group into, again, the side, just like with users, you have deleted groups. This is where you can see any groups that have been deleted, check the audit logs to figure out why they were deleted, or restore it if it should be restored. Jumping down to general, this is going to be where you can start turning on or turning off users or owners' ability to see who else is in a group, owners adding or removing members from the access panel, or even whether or not users can add other people to security groups. I would recommend turning some of these features off, but again, this is at your discretion and something you have the ability to do. Expiration and naming policy. This really centers around M365 groups and really it really becomes apparent in teams. So expiration, everyone loves creating teams. You probably have tons of teams in your environments. Teachers can create them. Some places even allow students, and they may create a team and then they're like, oh wait, I named this wrong, or I don't want to use this team, and it just kind of sits. If you have expiration set up and you can customize the amount of time, you can say after 180 days, this team, if it has not been touched for this amount of time, is deleted. There will be notifications that are sent to the owner 30 days, 15 days, and 1 day before. And if there isn't an owner, it'll be sent to whatever email address you specify here. But this is a great way to start auditing your environment and make sure you're not just having kind of a M365 group explosion. This does not apply to security groups for obvious reasons. You don't want a security group to suddenly time out and you've lost access to very important things. Naming policy is similar. So this is how you can enforce. So maybe you're allowing your students and teachers to create groups. Naming policies are where you can start coming in and saying, yes, they can create groups, but they can't use certain words, or they can't use certain words and they have to follow a certain naming policy. So it has to start with insert whatever type of prefix or suffix you like here. So moving on from groups, because I think I've spent plenty of time there, let's jump into roles and administration. So going back to Azure Active Directory, we're going to jump down to roles and administrators. This is going to be where all of those roles that I've been talking about live. You have tons of built-in roles to choose from, and I'm going to just jump into a few of them because once you understand how it works on a few, you can really start looking at what the others cover. So let's jump into Global Reader because that's something we've been talking about. So the Global Reader role, one, you'll see who's been assigned that role right here, and you can add assignments. You'll notice that I have eligible and expired as well. That comes with what's called privileged identity management, and that is that top tier P2. If you don't have that, you'll just see active assignments. But what that allows you to do is, again, set a role for a certain period of time and then it expires. So this is taking a little long to load. You would see here either groups or individual users that have been assigned this role. Under description, I think this is really important because under description, as it loads, I'm just reading through some questions. So, well, normally under description, you would see the specific groups or the specific guidelines that a group or that a role has. So in this case, you would see all of the different features that a global reader has access to. We'll come back to it in a second to see if we can get it to load. Looks like this group isn't loading for me at all. So let's pick a different one. Let's try Help Desk Administrator. There we go. So under Help Desk Administrator, you see the role permissions, the specific role here, and then what that role does here. And that's for every single role. And then it even goes into what the basic read permissions are. So what can this role read but not action versus what this role can actually do. And then if you come to role settings, this is where you can start customizing things at that higher level, again, at that P2, for things like activation settings, notification settings, who gets notified when this role becomes active for a certain user. Pretty great features fill into this location. But if we jump back to the roles, any one of these can be applied to whatever users or whatever groups you would like. You'll also notice we have new custom roles. You can create your own roles. However, right now it is limited to app registrations, which we're about to talk about. So for now, only app registration roles can be created. So what users can create new apps, load apps into enterprise applications, set up app proxy, things of that nature. But this is a great way to start understanding what roles you have access to and how you can use them in your environment simply by clicking into one of them and going through that description. So the next big area that I want to talk through, and I know I've got about 7 to 10 minutes left, the big area is going to be enterprise applications. So we talked about users, we've talked about groups, we've talked about Azure AD Connect and how that allows for authentication, but authenticating into what? What it allows you to authenticate into is what we're calling the enterprise applications or the app portal Azure AD Gallery. So you'll notice here when I click into the enterprise applications section, I have a whole bunch of choices and a whole bunch of random stuff listed here. The gist of this panel is these applications that you have added here can now be used for seamless sign-on. So any users that you have authenticated or that you have added to your Azure Active Directory, if they're added into a group that allows them to authenticate to one of these applications, they can then start using their on-premise accounts to authenticate into them. A great example that I made recently is Google Apps for Education. So if we dive into the Google Apps for Education, you'll notice that this application has all of the same settings that we've been seeing with users and groups, but it is a third-party application. And that's because within enterprise applications, other organizations like Google, like Workday, like ServiceNow, and tons of others can actually post their applications here, along with steps to how to configure it correctly to make sure that reply URLs are set correctly, login URLs are set correctly, domains are syncing, and it comes with these really nice, step-by-step guides. But once you have that app set up, so I have this Google Apps for EDU set up right now. Once you have that set up, you can then start going in and see the owners for this specific application are, what users and groups have access to it. So I was testing this with one of my test accounts, Clark Kent, to make sure it was working. Spoiler, it is not because I messed up the reply URL. But you can see who or what groups have access to it. And then you can start diving into the actual single sign-on and the SAML-based authentication setup. So you can come in here and start editing the reply states and the logout URLs, start editing the user attributes and claims, pulling the certificates that you need to set up these third-party integrations. And then you even have the ability to test it to make sure that this is working correctly. As we dive further down, you start seeing things like conditional access, which hopefully I'll have enough time to talk about here after this. But this is all going to be based on the application, that third-party application that you've added in. But what if you've developed a web-based application that you would like to authenticate with the same credentials that everyone's logging into Azure AD? For that, we have what we're calling app registration. So if I come down here to app registration, I don't have any because I don't have any custom-built apps. But if I did, you would start here and go to new registration. And what this allows you to do is take your custom-built web application and set it up in Azure AD to function exactly like an enterprise application. So you plug in all of the reply URLs, the APIs, the logout URLs to make sure that it is configured correctly. And then it actually appears exactly the same in enterprise applications as that third-party Google Apps. So you can then go into that custom-made web app and set permissions, set roles, set owners, just like you would any other app. So again, you're using Azure AD as that authentication source to then leverage into those custom-built apps. But what if you have an app that you have built, but it's on-premise. For that, we have something called app proxy. So application proxy allows you to, quote unquote, project your on-premise application into the portal. So you would actually see it in that enterprise applications location as well, which then opens the door for Azure AD to be leveraged again as that authentication source. This is fantastic because it allows you to enforce things like conditional access as well as MFA without having to move the app to the cloud or access each application or alter the code that would require a whole bunch of kind of uplift on your part. Similar process, but in this case, you're actually deploying a application proxy connector to that server that's hosting that app, and then you go through the steps to configure it. It's a little bit more time consuming than just setting up an enterprise application, but it is something that allows you to get around on-premise connections needed for certain apps. So one thing that we've done with the school that I help with, we've set this up for a financial management application to make sure that people don't have to use VPN or be on campus every time they're trying to authenticate. This allows you really to do that from Azure AD. So those are those three topics, and it really covers not only enterprise applications, but those web-based applications or even those applications that exist on-premise. So I've got just a few more minutes, and the last area that I really wanted to jump into is going to be the Security Center. So within Security Center, you have access to a whole bunch of wonderful features that allow you to start setting policies to enforce things like MFA, secure access, even jumping into things like identity protection or authentication methods. And we'll talk about some of those here in a bit, but the main one I want to talk about is going to be conditional access, because that's something that it is at that P1 level that we talked about earlier, but it allows for authentication, or it allows you to set specific requirements when it comes to authenticating to a cloud app. So if I jump into conditional access here, you'll notice that I have the ability to create a new policy. And with this new policy, you would give it a name, and then you would start assigning it to specific users or groups. So in this case, I want to build out a policy that enforces MFA for a specific cloud app, in this case, Google Apps. So I would come in here and say all users. You'll notice you get a little notification saying don't lock yourself out. If you don't want to do something for all users, that you don't have a specific account, maybe a global admin in case of, in case of emergency, break glass account. But for this, we're just going to go with all users. And then we're going to select cloud apps or actions. So this is where you can start selecting specific cloud apps that you have enabled or apply it to all. I'm going to select a specific one, and I'm going to select Google Apps. Once I've done that, I can then apply specific conditions. So under what conditions does this conditional access policy apply? You have a lot of different choices here. They range from user risk and sign-in risk. So based on this user's activity or based on the sign-in properties of this attempt, it seems like it might be a high-risk login, so I want to force them to log into MFA. Or it seems like it is a low risk, so we're not going to configure it. But you select those options here. You can also do it based on device platforms, so you can configure this so it's any device has to enforce this. You can exclude certain devices or certain types of operating systems. And the really nice feature, though, is going to be locations. So if you enable this, you can include any location, so any IP address that is trying to authenticate to Google Apps would be included in the multi-factor authentication push. Or you can exclude certain locations. So maybe you want to say any locations, however, I want you to exclude my on-premise IP range, because if someone's logging in from on-premise or on campus, you're not as worried about that of being a fraudulent attempt. For this, we're going to leave it as any location. You also have the ability to configure it based on client apps, so whether they're using modern auth or legacy authentication services. The last one's going to be device state, and this one's pretty interesting because you can start enforcing things like, I want this to be applied to every single device, but I want it to exclude devices that are either hybrid Azure AD joined or that devices that are already marked as compliant. So I know this device is secure, so I'm not going to make them log in or make them authenticate through MFA. But we're going to leave that off and go to what this actually does. So you set your conditions, you set when you want this to apply, in this case, all the time. And now we're coming to the actual controls. So I'm going to grant all users access to Google Apps for Education from any location, but I'm going to require multi-factor authentication. Once you've done this, you are now requiring all users to authenticate via multi-factor authentication. And that's a really great way of using conditional access to ensure that MFA is being enforced on your environment. So I'm going to jump out of that and not create it. The other areas within this location that I think are pretty good to talk about are going to be the identity secure score. So if we come down here, you can actually start seeing what your identity score is. Mine is very low because this is a demo tenant, but what your identity secure score is, and that is calculated based on how you align with Microsoft's best practices for identity and security, but also how you compare to other institutions, in this case education, that are of similar Active Directory sizes. So, other schools that are doing the same thing as you, how are you doing compared to them? It also provides you improvement actions. So you can come in here and see that this is the fact that I don't have MFA for administrative roles is impacting my score, but it's not impacting my users. And you can come in here and start ranking and figuring out, okay, which ones of these do I want to jump into? And you can click on it and get more descriptions about what it is, what the user impact would be, how much time it's going to take, what exactly you're about to do, and also how do you do it. So it's a great place to understand the changes that you would be making in your environment. The few other things, because I got about 2 minutes, the few other things that I want to talk about in this section are going to be, you can understand what risky users you have, risky sign-ins, and these are reports that run based on the actions or the properties of a certain user's login are, and maybe they're logging in from an IP address in another country, and that, they weren't able to do that yesterday, or even within a few minutes, one day they're logging in from your location, and then the next minute they're logging in from another location across the globe. That impossible travel, that's risky, right? That means this account, there may be something wrong. It will flag that account, and you'll see it here and be able to dive into it and understand what's happening, and then either confirm the user as compromised or dismiss that as, no, we understand someone is traveling overseas. They let us know about that, so this is expected. The last area that I think I'd really like to talk about, and there's a lot of areas I wasn't able to get to, but the last area I think that's important is password reset. This is where you configure SSPR for your cloud-based accounts or for your on-premise accounts if you have password write-back set up through Azure AD Connect. This is where you can start setting things like, are all users able to reset their password by themselves, or is it only a select group? What type of authentication methods are they allowed to use for this? And you can start enabling or disabling them here. You can even then jump into how often do you force a user to reconfirm their authentication. So is this number still valid? Is this email still valid? And then you can start getting into, are users notified of their password changes? What type of customization you want to do with it? So do you have a custom help desk link that shows, if you need help, go here? And then this is where you'd set up that password write back, and there are instructions to do that that I can send as well. Those are the topics that I really wanted to cover. There are a lot more areas that are really great, but I think those are, when you're getting into Azure Active Directory for the first time, those are some things that are going to be top of mind. The other areas you'll notice that we didn't cover, custom domain names, very similar to the domains that you would see in Office 365 Admin Center. You have the ability to create those custom domains here as well. You also have the ability to start doing company branding for website logins or those authentication locations. So when a user is logging into your environment, it feels a little bit more like home. And then the other areas that we didn't touch on are going to be devices. So these are those Azure AD joined devices. You can start seeing the devices. Are you managing them via Intune? Is it co-managed? What activity? Who owns it? All that kind of information. But from there, this is Azure Active Directory, kind of at that high level with deep dives into those users, groups, and enterprise apps. I'm going to jump over to questions. I noticed that Nick joined us. Thanks, Nick, for answering a lot of questions here. Were there any other questions that we needed to answer live, or are we good?
look, there might be a few left in the chat that might not have been addressed yet, if you wanted to skim through it.
Okay. Let's see here. Let's see.
I tried to thumbs up the ones that I think that Nick addressed.
Okay, that helps. And also feel free to come off mute if you have a question that you're worried might get overlooked. I'm scrolling through right now, but feel free to come off mute in our last few minutes here to ask a question.
It looks like Seth has his hand up.
All right.
Brian.
Go ahead, Seth.
No, I appreciate all the information that you provided. We have a question with regards to what would be the best way to manage. We have several thousands and tens of thousands of student users, and we're trying to find the best way to just appropriately license those that need the license. And the way we're doing it right now is we have a dynamic group to kind of catch all of our students so that they have the A1 license, but we would also like to legitimately license for the A3 licenses that we have, but we have a limit of those, and we're trying to find a way to where we can automate this process but avoid licensing conflicts, because we've found that when we're assigning an A1 license based off of that dynamic group, and then we try and go and assign like an A3 license, there's a conflict because they're already licensed with the A1 license. So it becomes kind of cumbersome, and we're trying to figure out what are best practices, best ways that others are trying to do to accomplish what we're trying to do, so that we have legitimate users that are licensed with the licensing that we have.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna answer that question with a follow-up question. So you've licensed a huge group of A1 users. Is there a distinguishing feature that separates the ones that should have A3 versus the ones that are going to have only A1?
Yeah, the distinguishing feature is that we're still trying to discover policy within our organization on what constitutes a current student, as based off of however many terms, so that we can actually give our current students, the students that are actually not inactive or actually attending, an A3 license, since we do have limited number of those, and we want to make sure that we are licensed and we can purchase any more additional licensing if need to. So we're kind of in that discussion at a higher level for policy, but eventually we're going to need to find some way to automate this to where we can have some sort of automated process or tool say, okay, this student or this group of students has dropped off the active list, and so now we're going to remove that A3 license, and even remove the A1 license or whatever, to kind of try and automate this process, and we're just trying to figure out how to do this without running into licensing conflicts like that.
Mm-hmm. That is a difficult one. I think Nick actually posted a comment about it as well, and that it's hard to answer in this type of environment because there's some specifics that for your accounts. But I think if you could figure out a way of distinguishing between the accounts that are active versus the accounts that are not, man.
And if I might clarify, we are working in discussions on that to come up with a process to where we're using Active Directory sync, or Connect, AD Connect, to sync that up, and we are in the process of developing a means by where we identify and we will be moving these accounts into a filtered OU that does not get synced. So we will limit that at that point. But until that happens, we're trying to find a way to it's very cumbersome on our help desk where they have to manage this or try and do this manual human intervention, and we want to free that up quite substantially with some sort of process.
Yeah, Nick Caramano, I hate to put you on the spot, but do you have kind of any feedback on this topic? Because that is a complicated one, especially when we're talking two separate license types. I'm not sure, he might have already dropped off.
I think you did drop. I think you had a call at 1.
Okay. Seth, this may be something where I think my email will be shared towards the end. I think this could be something where you could reach out to me and we may be able to kind of do a brainstorming session, because that is very difficult, especially if you're trying to distinguish between students that will be receiving two types of licenses, and the issues with assigning two licenses to the same student. You can do it, but you run into some conflicts, and there most likely will be a little bit of a manual process. And I'm not sure, I don't think I've actually had that experience where they're trying to remove that access. And I think once we get synced up, understanding what exactly in A1 or what exactly in A3 you're trying to give those students access versus what they have access to in A1 would be an important component to that as well, to see, okay, if we can't do this, how do we go about licensing in a different way to make sure this is happening? But you're on the right track, right? Using the dynamic groups is going to be the first step to make sure you're not having to manually add everyone to it, but trying to figure out a specific attribute that will differ between the two, where you have one group being created based on that attribute and one group being created based on another attribute that distinguishes between A1 and A3 licensing requirements. And then when a student drops off, when that attribute goes away, or when those attributes go away completely, they're removed from that group. But again, you'd have to have a custom attribute for that environment.
Could you use something like a department? Like, just say, like,
I mean, yeah.
If you're not using the department field for anything, you could just put remote and know that your A3 licenses will be allocated for that department only.
Yes, I believe you could. And then you could, I believe, so a topic we didn't touch on is Azure AD does have PowerShell integration, so you can still connect to your Azure AD environment via PowerShell. So if you have anyone that's good at PowerShell scripting, I'm curious if you could bash script that to add that attribute to a large amount of people, rather than having to go through and add it to every single individual student, which could take a little while. But I think that's a good path to go down. So create an attribute or create a either department field or something that's not being used for those students and set to remote versus set to campus or whatever it is. And those two distinguish who gets which version of the license.
If I may, the way I started out using this all when we moved to Office 365 is I created my students on-prem. I used one of the extra attribute fields and tracked what term that student was currently enrolled in. Mm-hmm. And then I went through the process manually. Now, having used all this for a while now, I can now see how I could use that to create dynamic groups. I still may have had to do a little tweaking, but by keeping track of what terms they were enrolled in, I would always know what students were current and what students had not been enrolled for a term or two, and could move their licenses or take them away.
Yeah, and it looks like there's a few, I think Eden was mentioning how they're using PowerShell and then exports from SIS to do something similar, possibly. So that could be a connection right there that you could make to see if maybe there could be some best practices shared.
I appreciate that, guys. Thank you very much.
So I know we are about 5 minutes over. I, again, have a pretty long laundry list of links to share. So I will be getting those over to OETC to then share out to everyone.
Real quick,
well.
Ryan, do you have 2 more minutes? Because I think Ken has his hand up. Do you have a question,
Yes.
Ken?
Yeah, I was curious. We're using a local on-prem for the student accounts because we want to basically manage and control the passwords they use so that they match what we've assigned to them. And I prefer to use and really enjoy Azure and have working with that for the first time this year. And that's where we have all our staff accounts, cloud-based only. I'd like to move the students from our local sync to the cloud and just also put them in Azure and just work specifically from the cloud only. And I'm curious, is there a way when you create a cloud user, if you can specify a password for them to have and then turn off the ability for that group to not be able to update their passwords or anything like that?
Interesting. So say you're coming in here, right? I think I'm still sharing my screen. And then you go to new user and you're going to create this account. And you want to be able to block them from being able to change the password.
Yeah, I'd like to do like a bulk update or bulk create and for all our student users, and then just assign them a non-temporary but established password.
That should be possible. I do know that's possible through the Office 365 Admin Center. I've done that, and I've done that in bulk. So you basically create, it's not shared right now, but you do download CSV template for bulk creating. And this is actually going to give you options across the board for username, initial password, block sign in, either no, and you kind of go across. Let's see here. Does this tell us anything? Because there is, on this form, you'll actually see that there's an initial password. Again, I know in here, when I've gone through users, active users, add multiple users, it's the same type of thing. And in this process, you can actually turn off, like you set the password and that's just their password. And it's hard to turn off the ability to change that password. Well, no, you could do that through turning off self-service password reset. So you would come in here and you would go to password reset, you would do none. So now no one in your environment, or you could do a selected group. So if you have a dynamic group based off students, you could have that group saying, no, they can't change their password. And then the initial password that you set for them should be maintained as the password.
Perfect. Okay.
But I would recommend trying either the bulk upload through users, create users, bulk operations, and bulk create, or again, through this route here, the accounts will be synced in both locations. So try one of those.
If they're already in the Azure right now, and I want to sever that sync between the AD and this works, do I have to reestablish their account in Azure once I sever the syncing process?
Oh, that's a good question. So I know that I believe so. And the reason I'm saying I believe is when I had done this, my accounts had actually disappeared because they are no longer being pulled in from a location. So if you're going that route, I think I would recommend doing something along the lines of a bulk create. So you would create an export from your sys, bulk create all of the accounts, and when you sever that tie, the account should disappear that were on-prem based, cloud only, right? So these accounts like mine here, all of these would stay because they're cloud-based. So any cloud-based accounts you had created during that sync would still be there. Sever the tie and then upload that bulk create based off the sys, or maybe even an Active Directory export, depending on what type of form. But the important thing is making sure that it's as closely matched template that you'll see, because it would be difficult to start customizing it or pulling fields from across the board. But I would recommend trying that. Okay. So cut the tie. If you have the ability to do that in a test environment or a test smaller group, I would recommend doing that. But yeah, cutting the tie and then uploading should work.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Of course. Try keeping the UPNs the same as on-prem. That may be a key field to the tie. That's a good point. If the UPNs change, that could be a way to break that connection manually. All right, let me stop.
Looks like we have one more question.
Of course.
Hey, Max.
Yes, I posted it in the chat, didn't see if it got answered, but it was more of a question towards the multi-factor authentication. Currently at our ESD, we're using Duo, so I noticed you touched on how multi-factor authentication is established through the Azure process, but what if we want to integrate with a third-party provider?
That is actually where you would start utilizing Azure Active Directory Federation services. So if I come down here to Azure AD Connect, you'll see that there's Federation. I believe one of the documents I'm going to send actually talks through the different types of connections. There's also a link to like setting up ADFS, but ADFS specifically gives you the ability to use third-party authentication services in front of the login. So what it would do is the accounts would still be synced. You would hit one of these cloud-based apps and you would use ADFS instead. So it would still authenticate via on-premise, and it would hit your You log in, hit multi-factor, everything works, kicks it back to the Azure portal. Well, kick it back to Azure SSO, and then it would authenticate to the application that they're trying to get to. So ADFS would be the route for you.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? These have been great. Especially if you're trying to figure out, okay, third-party authentication, third-party multi-factor, ADFS is going to be your best friend. If you don't want passwords to be synced to, or password hashes to be synced to your Azure AD environment, you're going to want to use Azure AD Pass-Through. Also, if you want to enforce user states, password policies, and sign-in hours, those types of requirements that normally happen in an on-prem environment, you're going to want to use it pass-through as well. And then password hash is when you want Azure AD to handle pretty much authentication from start to finish. Again, that is where, and you're going to have access to it. Where did it go? This one. This is where this comes in handy, right? So, actually, you asked specifically about, it's not on here, but federation is going to be your answer when it comes to multi-factor authentication. So you would be over in this area, but definitely follow this chart to go through. Here it is. Do you have a sign-in requirement not related supported by Azure AD? That kicks you over here. You'll notice sign-in features not supported by Azure AD, signing using an on-premise MFA server, or these other options. So take a look at this once we get that article to y'all, and it should help. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thanks, everyone, for joining. This was great. I loved all the questions. Again, I'll get some links sent y'all's way. You'll also have the recording for this. Thank you, OETC, for bringing me in. This was a lot of fun, and I hope it was helpful for everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. For anyone still on the call, we will send out the links that Ryan sends out, as well as a recording of this webinar next week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.